I'm Joan Gore, and I'm conducting a video interview project for the Association of International Education Administrators so that we have a history of how our field has developed and changed. And we're interviewing people who are coming to some conclusion of their career or will be concluding their career in the next few years, and who have contributed to the changes and the development, immense transition and development that international education has experienced in the last 30 years. I'm talking with Bill Lacy, and Bill, if you could tell me the position you hold now.
Well, I'm the Vice Provost for University Outreach and International Programs at UC Davis. Been in that job for about 15 years. It was a brand new position when I assumed it. It includes two functions because they weren't quite sure they wanted to have a single Vice Provost exclusively for the international programs. So I had a portfolio that also included the University Outreach and Engagement, which was already in existence. So they merged the Vice Provost position for international with that, which suggests some of the changes that have occurred over time.
Right.
That position was jointly held by a person who was also the dean of the graduate school. So the outreach and engagement was seen clearly as academic. It was unclear where the international program area fell within a continuum from student affairs through undergraduate education,
right,
and now to a portfolio that included more than both of those areas.
Right.
So it's been a good move and a good run for me.
And as we were discussing earlier, your career itself and that job and that position and how it's developed are in some ways a metaphor for how significant international education has become within higher education, and the recognition that it has now that it probably did not have when you first began that position.
Well, the position itself was created first in 1990, and then because of budget issues, the position was eliminated in California by the chancellor, and then resurfaced through a process of strategic planning, appointment of task forces to make the case all over again,
right,
and reemerged in 1998, and then I assumed the position in 1999.
Right.
But that suggests the kind of evolution across the country. These positions didn't exist in many institutions. And when they did, they often were a director, and they often focused only or exclusively on student mobility, either sending our students overseas or bringing students to the U.S. And that's evolved considerably as well.
So how do you see the breadth of what international education is today? What are the components of it that you see that have really emerged under this rubric?
Well, it's interesting. There were components of international activities all across the campus, but there wasn't any senior leadership that was integrating them in any way. As I said, study abroad was often either in student affairs or in an undergraduate education office, if they had an undergraduate education office, because that's also emerged in my career. I watched that being created as well. It predated the international office, but there were often little or no leadership at the undergraduate level. Individual colleges provided coordination.
Right.
So there's been an interesting evolution of these fields. But you also had, in many of the colleges of agriculture, and I've worked in 4.
Right.
Very strong international ag development. And USAID has been working for a long time with multi-million-dollar grants. And my involvement with international was not through study abroad, not through services for international students and scholars, but through USAID contracts. I was a consultant in India to look at the institution building that occurred there, and that occurred in the 50s. So it predates a lot of the effort.
It's really interesting, isn't it? That's a branch of higher education that has driven a lot of development in international.
That's right. And the institution building allowed for connections between U.S. universities and these Indian institutions that were being established. I did the same thing in Brazil in terms of their institutions, and the universities that participated in both those places included Purdue, Davis, Michigan State, Arizona, Wisconsin. I'm just trying to think of the universities that I knew that had collaborations in those two places, and both developed very quite strong higher education institutions, in large part because of the effort of international leadership that occurred in our universities. And then I was a consultant for the Brazilian agricultural research system. So my experience coming to this was quite different. And that's been an important part. And now I bring...
In what way? I mean, can you articulate that?
It was an effort to take our knowledge of institutions and our research in agriculture and our knowledge about how you disseminate that research through cooperative extension and extend it in key places around the world. And it's still critical today. It's as critical today as it ever was. AID is putting tens of millions of dollars into an effort to, quote, feed the world. So it's quite interesting to see that that's a very important part of it. I wasn't involved with Title VI centers and the language and culture because I don't come out of that tradition. I'm a social scientist, and I'm interested in the organization and structure of science. And also the dissemination of knowledge, so those aspects of it. So it's been interesting to see this evolve. Research has increasingly become internationalized. Knowledge knows no boundaries. And as a consequence, a lot of collaboration has occurred, independent of any centralized office. Very few of our faculty were involved in faculty-led programs overseas. A lot of the study abroad programs were full immersion in language and attracted women in the social sciences and humanities. And I think that's begun to change, but it's taken a lot of effort. So there have been a variety of interesting
it is interesting, too, that it's been agriculture, sometimes engineering, other science and technologies that have driven some growth in international education, and yet in some components of it, it is still traditionally rooted in the liberal arts, and gender breakdowns still are largely female, even when you go into these new science and technology areas.
Well, in the area of undergraduate education, that's the case. But in terms of collaborative research and outreach and engagement, it's the opposite. The humanities and social sciences aren't
there at all.
Yeah, they aren't out there in West Africa developing the irrigation systems or new cropping systems or cooperative extension of that knowledge. But they're needed. And part of the strange thing for me was being part of projects where the agricultural scientists didn't know what to do with the social scientists. Until we point out to them that the whole way in which they could function over there required a knowledge of organizations, required a knowledge of how research is generated and disseminated, how addressing the cultural needs and the contextual needs made a big difference. That simply taking whatever we had in this country and taking it over there often made little or no sense. And it wasn't the ignorant farmer that was problematic. It was the ignorant researcher that was problematic.
I mean, that is very interesting, too, because as we talk about much debated terms like internationalization and globalization of knowledge or global citizenship, it really is interesting that in many ways, thoughtful humanities and social science education needs to be a part of making any international activity or research project or study abroad or even inbound student population or inbound guest lecturers and faculty. It has to be a part of it for all of them. And it really isn't. I mean, it isn't yet.
No, but that's the issue of how we generate knowledge. It's in disciplinary silos. And it's not, I mean, often the historian doesn't talk to the political scientist, who doesn't talk to the sociologist. So we're also isolated from each other, even within the social sciences and the humanities.
Right.
And there's a much greater need for that integration. I mean, it's often argued that society has problems and universities have departments and disciplines.
Yes.
And often they
yes.
don't. And often they don't come together
Right.
very, very effectively. So, so we've seen considerable development and change, and a recognition that we need to provide and facilitate leadership at the senior level, and that's occurring across the country now.
It is.
So, and that's pretty exciting. We've also seen, obviously, an expansion of a number of students studying abroad, and we've seen an enormous increase in the number of students and scholars coming to the U.S.
Yes.
And what's interesting in our institution was the largest international population were scholars. Postdocs, sabbatical
Really?
leaves,
Yes,
research
of course,
collaborators.
because of the nature of what you're doing.
And the next largest group were international graduate students. And the smallest group at Davis for the longest time were the undergraduate international students. And now, just now, it's expanding. We're recognizing that we are shortchanging our students, particularly those who can't afford to go overseas, by not creating an international community. And on the Davis campus, we only had 2% of our student body that were international undergraduate students. 25% of the graduate students, a third of our new faculty hires in the last 10 years were international scholars, and by that I meant at least completed their baccalaureate degree overseas, not born over there and moved here at 5 or 10 or 15, but at least graduating from an institution where they were bringing their culture, they're bringing their world perspective, and worldview, which was quite different and complemented ours. A third of those. It's a changing environment that we're living in, a very exciting one for that reason. Challenging as well, because the institutions haven't fully thought through what they need to do to make this truly an international community. You can bring all these people together, and if they isolate themselves, then you've defeated some of the purpose of doing that.
You know, it's interesting because what you're doing is turning the term global citizenship around, because it's used so frequently to describe how we are going to educate our American students. But if I hear you correctly, you're saying it's equally important to think about what we're doing on domestic campuses for our foreign student and faculty populations.
Absolutely. Absolutely. One model, of course, is to create a center, and historically, by the way, we did that in about 5 or 6 institutions. We built international houses at Berkeley and Chicago, and in New York and Philadelphia. And I've been on a campaign for a dozen years to try and do a similar kind of project on our campus. And we visited Melbourne, we visited England, we've looked at some other models. And we now have 3 design proposals, and we'll be selecting one within a month.
That's exciting. That's a great way for you to retire, isn't it?
Well, I'm not retiring, but I'm going to be...
or be retiring at one point in time.
Yes, I'm going back to the faculty, but I'm going to be on the same campus. So
you will be next year there if I wanted to come and track you down to do this again.
Well, I'm going on sabbatical leave too, so you'll have to...
I'll find you anywhere.
Perhaps you'll have to come to East Africa or Australia.
Works for me.
You don't want to stop being international just because you're going back to the faculty. So.
That's right, and that's a great point, because how do you see yourself as you transition away from doing this work specifically?
Well, I'll be doing more scholarship and perhaps more consulting, but not as much administration.
Right.
And that can be empowering.
Right. Right.
You make different kinds of decisions, and you have different kinds of impact.
Right.
The administration requires a lot of effort on budget and personnel. And one of the joys of this job is it's involved a lot of program.
Yeah.
Which has been really a pleasure. One of the advantages of this field is that we don't have huge budgets and huge personnel.
That's true. We have to innovate.
And so you can focus, and be creative and go after funds and match funds and so on. I mean, when I was with Cooperative Extension, I had 2,500 employees, and a budget in excess of $100 million.
Right.
67 counties, 600,000 youth in 4-H, and very little time to deal with program.
Right. Right.
the international office, in part because it's been smaller, much
Right.
smaller, has given us, and new, so you're not having to maintain a lot of programs that were around, have allowed us to be experimental, to be creative, to try new things. And that's been fun. That's been fun.
I can well imagine.
I mean, we're launching a 2-week program overseas for our honor students, freshman honor students, before they even start their classes in the fall, this next fall. And,
that's great.
And and we're doing one for the social sciences, one for the natural sciences, and one for the humanities, so that all 3 groups of students who are coming to our honors college will get that 2-week experience.
They have that fundamental, grounded international perspective from the start.
Absolutely, and what we hope that'll do was encourage them across the board, from the humanities, social, and the physical sciences, to take advantage of the programs that we're developing.
You know, it's going to be very exciting to track that.
Yes,
and to see how that works. And my guess is it's going to work very well.
And you know, when we also had a quarter abroad program that was faculty-led. Often the faculty-led programs are summer abroad, and the full immersion programs are with other partners outside the campus. Our faculty aren't going over and doing it. But we started a quarter abroad program a few years ago, and it was all in the social science. It was basically in language. But we have one in Taipei on pharmaceutical chemistry.
Wow.
With the AIEA Seneca. We've got the room to try and experiment and do something creative like that. Now 1/3 of our summer abroad classes are in engineering and the sciences.
So that is another huge change.
Yes, yes.
Huge change.
The other is, you know, there are now about 200 campuses, not about 100 of them in the U.S., but about 200 universities that have a global center, often a branch campus. It depends.
Right.
But that's new.
Right.
Over the last 10, 15 years. Another is consortium, international consortia that bring together groups. The Universitas 21, the Association of Pacific Rim Universities. I'm part of that. I'm hosting a meeting in 2 days. No, I'm hosting a meeting tomorrow. With the senior SIOs from North America on the West Coast. This is the 45 leading universities in the Pacific Rim, and the AAU campuses on the West Coast. And we're doing a variety of things internationally with them. There are consortia. I mean, within that group, the presidents get together, the SIOs get together, the deans of law, and there are now. So that's the administrative. We have a program for undergraduate students. We have a program for graduate students. We have a program then we have subject matter areas that bring together the scientists in the Pacific Rim around earthquakes, tsunamis, geophysical issues. I mean, it's the Rim of Fire. Public health, and that's another one around climate change is a third. Whole new models for bringing together institutions, and not just U.S. institutions, but this is now a group. I say 45, 6 in Japan, 6 in China, 4 in Australia, I think a dozen or so in North America, 2 in Mexico, one in Chile, 3 in Korea.
So this is a tremendous reflection of the Pacific Rim that you're bringing together.
Yeah, and it's a whole new way of doing work and collaborations. But you know, we sometimes forget the Fulbright program has been around since the 40s. So at the same time we're doing new things, I think we have to acknowledge that there have been some very creative efforts for around there a long time.
Well, I think it was the generation post-World War II to probably the late 80s, early 90s, who laid the groundwork.
That's right.
For what could happen after and what has. I think we're the second generation of modern educators who are defining and developing international education, and it is standing on the shoulders of that first generation.
Yeah, or earlier. I mean, we just talked about the international centers. Those were in the 30s.
Right.
The Fulbright program in the 40s.
First big study abroad programs were in the 20s and 30s.
And exactly. And the mobility was there. I mean, if you look at some of our earlier universities, Harvard was hosting scholars from around the world, and many of our scholars were going to Europe to work and study. So there's been a long tradition of international. It's now becoming more core
Right.
to the
It becomes part of the mission statement of a university.
Right. So,
well, Bill, I would very much like to conclude by asking you what you think you're going to be doing in the near future with your life and your vision.
I am going to retool a bit, going back, as I say, to the faculty in human ecology.
Right.
My area of interest is in the sociology of science and in how we generate knowledge and disseminate knowledge, university-industry partnerships in that process.
Right.
And I might take a look at I've been doing that both nationally and internationally.
Mm-hmm.
I'm also looking at the whole issue of the interface between global food security, environmental sustainability, and poverty alleviation. Are those truly competitive or complementary goals?
Right.
And
your background with agriculture is perfectly suited to
that. And I've written enough to put most people to sleep. If you've had a challenge with sleeping and insomnia, I have 6 books to recommend to you.
I'm sure I would enjoy them.
So I'm going to go back and do some of that, and then enjoy more time with my wife. We're planning a safari in Africa.
Wow.
We're planning on going down the Grand Canyon in wooden dories.
Wow.
In August.
So you took academic adventures, and now you're taking physical adventures.
We are, yes. So there are lots of opportunities out there. So I'm looking forward to the next step in my journey.
Well, thank you. Thank you so much for being my experiment, because this is the first, and we're not even sure technologically if this is working.
Whether we've done anything right.
That's right. But it's been a pleasure, and I think it's wonderful to have this discussion, because it's kind of a meta discussion as the first interview. So thank you, and I appreciate your time.
And you can see I come at this in a very different way.
Very different way.